It looked like nothing. Just another parcel drop, on just another quiet street. A white van rolls up outside a semi on Crockdale Road West and West Derby. Mid-morning, light traffic, curtains half drawn. One man steps out in a courier's jacket, parcel in hand, the picture of routine. Behind him, 3 others slip out, faces hidden by balaclavas, moving in formation like they have done this before. To anyone watching from across the road, it is harmless. A knock at the door, a murmur of voices, a delivery being signed for. But the second the latch turns, the mask drops. Machetes flash into view. The faux courier lunges forward. Within seconds, the hallway is a war zone. The door is answered by 59-year-old Paul Glenn and his son. They barely have time to register the men before the blades are up. Glenn is slashed down to the bone. Steel tearing deep into flesh, his blood splattering across the walls and floor. His son tries to hold them back, swinging, grabbing, fighting to keep them from pushing further inside. He fails. 4 men, armed and determined, are too much. In less than a minute, father and son are on the wrong end of a robbery they never saw coming. There are no signs outside this place. No gang tags, no expensive cars, no suspicious comings and goings. On paper, it is just another house on a Liverpool estate. But for those who know, Crockdale Road West is more than bricks and mortar. It is a depot. A stash house. A silent vault, full of product. Today, that vault is being emptied. The masked men move with a purpose that screams preparation. They head straight to the stash. No searching, no hesitation. They know exactly where they are going. In a matter of moments, they are hauling out tightly wrapped blocks, 30 kilos of high-grade cocaine worth over £1 million on the street. The drugs are bundled into bags, rushed back to the white van waiting outside. No shouting, no wild panic, just cold efficiency. 4 minutes after they arrive, they are gone. The house is left behind in chaos. Blood on the floor, Glenn gravely wounded, his son shaken and helpless. But the damage is not just physical. Somewhere, far above this small, ordinary-looking semi, a much bigger problem has just been created. Because this house does not belong to some small-time local crew. It is part of the infrastructure of one of Merseyside's most violent and organised crime syndicates. The Heighton Firm. And the product that just vanished belongs to the man at the top of that pyramid. His name is Vincent Coggins. By 7:41 that evening, Coggins is staring at the footage. Grainy CCTV pulled from a neighbour's system shows it all. The white van, the fake courier. The masked men, the swift entry, and then the van, pulling away heavier than it arrived. In a few silent frames, £1 million of his stock disappears. He does not take it calmly. To his associates, Coggins insists this is not just about money, it is personal. No local gang would dare hit him, he says. That means betrayal. An inside job. Someone arrogant enough to think they could rob the Heighton Firm and live. He wants names. He wants answers. And, above all, he wants someone to pay. Because somewhere down the line, when the wrong name is whispered into the wrong ear, a different man will step into this story. A father who will put land, even houses, and every last pound he has on the table, £1.3 million in total, to save his son from a murder order he never earned. This is the story of the ransom he paid, the empire that took the money, and why, even after all that, they still wanted blood. The men who pulled off the raid did not hang around to admire their work. As Paul Glenn lay bleeding, and the sirens had not even started, the white van was already threading its way out of West Derby, carrying 30 kilos of stolen cocaine, and 4 men who knew exactly what they were just done. This was not a random smash and grab. It began weeks earlier with a plan. Jason and Craig Cox, 2 brothers from Salford, had made a career out of calculated violence. For this job, they teamed up with a seasoned Liverpool criminal, Richard Caswell, a man who knew the streets, the people, and, crucially, which doors mattered. The 4th man, Ben Monks Gorton, was chosen because he could play a part. The calm, convincing delivery driver at the front of the operation. They watched the house on Crockdale Road West in the weeks leading up to the 23rd of May 2020. Early mornings, late nights, comings and goings, patterns. They were not interested in who lived there, because no one really did. To them, this was not a home. It was a depot, a warehouse disguised as a family address. Once they were satisfied they understood the routine, they picked their moment, 9:30 a.m. broad daylight, when a delivery would not raise an eyebrow. They moved, hit fast, and vanished even faster. While the van wound its way out of Liverpool, the stash was already being mentally divided, offloaded in their heads before it was even touched. Somewhere in the background, safe houses and buyers were lined up, people ready to move £1 million worth of product piece by piece. The Cox brothers and their crew were already thinking ahead. The Heighton Firm, meanwhile, was still reeling. By that evening, the footage from the neighbour's CCTV was in the hands of Vincent Coggins. He would watched it, replayed it, studied the blurred movements of the masked men, and the outline of the Ye de Rye, the van. The anger that followed was not theatrical. It was cold, measuring, focused. Coggins turned to the one tool he trusted most, EncroChat, call. Using the handle moonlit boat, he reached out to his inner circle. His messages were calm in tone, but every line dripped with intent. He contacted Lieutenants Paul Woodford, Robert Jarvis, and Michael Earl. Their job was simple: find out who took the drugs. If they could not dig up the truth, then they would burn down gossip until someone talked. Rumors surfaced quickly. The first name tossed into the mix was Kenny Glenn, the son who had been at the door when the machetes came through. Maybe he would set it up, they said. Maybe he would tip someone off. Then another name floated, Paul Flynn. Faces, grudges, old rivalries, all of them were fair game, in the search for a culprit. Then came the turn. The quiet, deadly kind of shift that changes everything. Out of nowhere, Coggins fixated on another local dealer, Brian Maxwell Jr. There was no presence at the scene, no clear link, no solid motive tying him to the raid. But Maxwell Jr. had a reputation: young, smart, careful. He operated discreetly and always stayed close to his father, a man with serious connections and serious property. In Coggins' world, that was enough. His messages on Encro grew sharper. He told his associates he had Maxwell nailed. The stolen cocaine began to matter less than the insult he felt. This was not about balancing the books anymore. It was about making an example. When Woodford asked if weapons would be needed, Coggins shut the question down with chilling certainty. He already had what they needed. Guns were in place. Blades were ready. He even asked for a pineapple, the street code for a hand grenade. Jarvis confirmed one could be sourced. They were not just looking for a thief, they were preparing for a hit. The plan was simple in its brutality: find Brian Maxwell Jr., strike fast, and send a message so loud that no one would ever dare steal from the Heighton Firm again. To understand why the wrong name stuck, you have to understand the man behind it. Brian Maxwell Sr. was not the kind of figure you saw splashed across headlines. He did not run flashy nightclubs or drive supercars. In the drug world, his power lay in something quieter, more methodical. He built houses not in the literal sense, but in the criminal sense, silent earning machines hidden in plain sight. Across Merseyside and beyond, Maxwell Sr. owned properties. Dozens of them. On paper, he was a landlord. In reality, many of those addresses were something else entirely. Large-scale cannabis farms cleverly disguised as ordinary rental homes. From the outside, nothing looked off. Lawns trimmed. Windows clean. Curtains moved just enough to suggest someone lived there. He even paid gardeners and neighbors to maintain hanging baskets and tidy front gardens, because details mattered. To a passerby, these places blended into the background of suburban life. Inside, it was a different world. Upstairs rooms were stripped bare, lined with grow tents. Industrial fans whirred quietly. Heat lamps glowed, but never in a way that screamed through a thermal camera. Everything was carefully shielded, balanced. Power was diverted and spread out to avoid suspicious spikes. Downstairs, the picture was normal, sofas, TVs, dining tables. If the police ever knocked unexpectedly, the first impression would be standard rental, not drug factory. It was not glamorous, but it was efficient. And it paid. His son, Brian Maxwell Jr., grew up around this operation. He did not stumble into crime, he inherited it like a trade. By 2020, father and son were working closely together. They handled supply quietly, moved products steadily, and avoided chaos. They did not shout on social media or spray champagne in clubs. Conversations happened face-to-face, or through encrypted devices. They knew how fragile an empire built on secrecy really was. Then came the whispers. In the aftermath of the Crockdale Road raid, rumors started to coil their way through the streets. A name was being attached to the robbery, a name that had nothing to do with what actually happened in those 4 minutes. Word began to circulate that the man behind the £1 million stash house hit was Brian Maxwell Jr. When that reached Maxwell Sr., something inside him snapped into focus. He confronted his son directly, not as a gangster, but as a father. He did not want excuses, he wanted proof. And Maxwell Jr. had it. CCTV footage. Clear as day, time-stamped and fixed. It showed he had not left his house at all on the 23rd of May 2020. He could not have been anywhere near Crockdale Road when the blades came out and the van pulled away. On paper, the alibi was perfect. In a courtroom, it might have been enough. But this was not a courtroom. This was Vincent Coggins' world. Out there, the truth did not matter. The rumor mattered. The story mattered. The idea that someone like Maxwell Jr. could be clever enough, resourced enough, connected enough to arrange a robbery of that scale that was enough to brand him guilty in the eyes of the Heighton Firm. And now there was a price on his son's head. Faced with that reality, Maxwell Sr. made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He told his son to disappear, to go to ground and stay quiet. Then he reached out through a mutual associate, sending a message up the chain toward the Coggins brothers. His offer was simple in words, devastating in cost: land, a house and cash. More than £1.3 million in total, handed over as a single, unspoken ransom for his son's life. He was not asking for friendship. He was not asking for fairness. He was effectively saying, treat this as payment in full. I will carry the blame. Just leave my boy alive. The proposal went up the chain and reached Vincent Coggins. On the surface, the deal was accepted. On the 3rd of June 2020, paperwork was signed. Titles were transferred. Money moved. Officially, the transaction was complete. Unofficially, in EncroChat messages, Coggins was still seething. To his inner circle, he made it clear the debt might be settled on paper, but in his mind, nothing had changed. Maxwell Jr. was still marked. The only difference now was timing. To see why the deal was doomed from the start, you have to go back before the robbery, before the ransom, before EncroChat itself, to the place that shaped the men behind the Heighton Firm. Cantrell Farm Estate in Merseyside was one of those places left behind when industry collapsed. Factories closed, jobs vanished, and the gaps they left were quickly filled by something else. In that vacuum, power was not about job titles or status, it was about fear. And nobody understood that better than the Coggins brothers. Vincent and Francis Coggins grew up in a world where the police were just another threat, and the only real safety came from who you stood next to. They learned young that reputation traveled faster than truth. A whispered story about what you would done or what people thought you would done was worth more than any official record. Over the next 3 decades, they turned that understanding into an empire. At its height, the Heighton Firm was more than just a local crew. It was a network. Cocaine and heroin moved in bulk from South America to Spain, then into the UK through ports and contacts that took years to build. From Liverpool, the drugs were pushed further out north to Scotland, south to places like Plymouth, then sliced into smaller deals that powered hundreds of street operations. EncroChat messages would later show just a snapshot: over 140 kilos of cocaine and nearly 250 kilos of heroin traded in only 3 months. and everyone knew those numbers were just the visible part of something much bigger. But the drugs were only one pillar, the other was violence. The Heighton Firm used violence like a tool, not a tantrum. There were men on regular pay who were there for one job: damage. One of those men, Thomas Cashman, would later be convicted of killing 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell, a case that shocked the country. Others ran collections, enforced debts, moved weapons, or kept watch. A chain of command ran straight up to the Coggins brothers, and breaking that chain was rarely survived. Vincent was the one on the ground, running Merseyside side of the business. Francis, believed to be operating from the Costa del Sol, managed European logistics, making sure the supply lines from Spain stayed open and profitable. They were not reckless. They built layers around themselves, buffers of fixers, couriers and lieutenants. And when they spoke, they did not do it on ordinary phones. They used EncroChat, the encrypted network criminals believed was unbreakable. On there, they were not Vincent and Francis. They were Moonlit Boat, Soft Herb, King Wasp. Their associates had their own handles: Olive Scooter, Blade Hedge, and more. Orders were issued, threats typed out like shopping lists, deals arranged in coded slang. For a long time, they believed those screens made them invisible. What they did not know was that in early April 2020, French and Dutch authorities quietly hacked into EncroChat itself. There was no warning banner, no glitch, no obvious sign anything had changed. The network kept running, messages still sent. But behind the scenes, something massive had shifted. Every message was being copied. Those intercepted chats were handed to agencies across Europe. In the UK, the National Crime Agency and the Northwest Regional Organised Crime Unit received a live feed straight into criminal conversations, including the Coggins brothers, Competector la Rose IT world. The operation was given a name, Subzero, part of the wider EncroChat response known as Operation Venetic. From that moment, every threat, every order, every mention of the Cox brothers, the Stash House raid, and the plan to kill Brian Maxwell Jr. was being recorded in real time. Investigators did not just store the messages. They studied them. They matched handles to faces, locations to phone pings, jokes about takeaway food to specific addresses. They zoomed into background details on photos: a distinctive sofa, a garden fence, a road sign caught in the corner of a selfie. Bit by bit, Moonlit Boat and Soft Herb stopped being mysterious usernames and became people with full names, dates of birth, and home addresses. What the Coggins brothers saw as privacy had become, without them knowing, the blueprint of their destruction. And while they were still planning hits and fantasizing about revenge on a man who'd just paid them £1.3 million to stand down, the police were quietly building a case that would take apart everything they would spent 3 decades creating. Once EncroChat was cracked, the Heighton Firm's biggest weapon, its secrecy, turned into evidence. Inside the offices of the National Crime Agency and the Northwest Regional Organised Crime Unit, detectives were not guessing anymore. They were reading. In real time, message after message flowed across their screens: drug orders, cash tallies, casual threats, and buried among it all, detailed plans for murder. Handles that had once seemed abstract: Moonlit Boat, Soft Herb, Olive Scooter, Blade Hedge, were now pinned to faces and addresses. And at the center of the storm sat Moonlit Boat himself, Vincent Coggins, raging over his missing million and obsessing over the name he would chosen as the scapegoat: Brian Maxwell Jr. The messages were not empty bluster. The Encro logs showed plans and progress. The threats against Maxwell were not vague hints. They were concrete. Coggins named targets, mapped out possible locations, and talked about weapons as if he were assembling a toolkit. Alongside Maxwell Jr., 2 more names surfaced as potential victims: Michael East and Ayabosa Igbenovia. They, too, were dragged into the gravitational pull of Coggins' paranoia. What started as revenge over a stash robbery was turning into a list of people marked for execution. For investigators, this changed the timeline. They were not just building a drug and conspiracy case anymore. They were watching a murder plot develop in real time. and they knew they could not afford to wait until the perfect moment to swoop. One delay, one misstep, and someone could end up dead. So they moved. On the 27th of May 2020, just days after the raid on Crockdale Road, officers turned up not at the homes of the gangsters making threats, but at the doors of their intended victims. At Maxwell Jr.'s home, police served an Osman warning, an official document telling him, clearly and formally, that his life was in danger. They explained there was credible intelligence that someone wanted him dead. The same thing happened for the two others Coggins had named. One knock. One warning. A blunt message, you are on someone's hit list. But the police did not stop there. They knew that protecting the potential victims was only half the job. The other half was putting the would-be killers on notice. So Coggins, along with key associates Paul Woodford, Michael Earl and Robert Jarvis, received disruption notices. Formal warnings from law enforcement, spelled out in clear language. We know what you are planning. We are watching, and if you act, we will come down on you hard. It was a calculated move, part deterrent, part psychological pressure. For a moment, it seemed to work. Michael Earl, spooked by the rising temperature, appeared to back away. The idea of carrying out a hit while the police had just knocked on his door with a warning did not sit comfortably. For some, self-preservation started to override loyalty. But Vincent Coggins was not wired that way. On EncroChat, he continued to vent. The messages stayed dark and simmering. He told his inner circle he would accepted Maxwell Sr.'s £1.3 million ransom, but insisted the score was not settled. The dad, he said, could be left alone for now. The son, though, that was different. Maxwell Jr. was still a target, just one that might have to wait until the heat died down. While all this was unfolding, another thread was tightening. EncroChat data from a separate investigation operation, Venetic, dug into the robbery itself. Messages revealed that local criminal Richard Caswell, the man who had played the concerned insider, was not a bystander at all. He had been in contact with Jason and Craig Cox both before and after the raid. He had spoken to the Heighton Firm as if he were trying to help them find the culprits, when in reality he was feeding their fear back to the Cox brothers, keeping them one step ahead of retaliation. When that truth leaked into criminal circles, the backlash was swift. Caswell, already locked up on another matter, was attacked inside prison, slashed across the face, in a brutal reminder of what betrayal costs. The Cox family were issued threat-to-life warnings. In Salford, arson attacks hit properties linked to them. The pressure, the danger, the chaos, it all escalated. Jason and Craig Cox did what many in their position do when the walls start closing in. They fled to Spain. By the time Coggins finally realized who had really taken his £1 million stash, it was too late. The damage was done. The wrong people had been threatened. Millions had shifted hands, and his own messages had been quietly copied and catalogued by the police. The Heighton Firm's focus was starting to shift. It was not just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. At 6:00 a.m. on the 16th of June 2020, the Heighton Firm woke up to the sound of their world ending. Across Liverpool and Knowsley, front doors did not open. They came off their hinges. Armed officers flooded hallways where, only hours before, encrypted phones had been glowing in darkened rooms. Operation Subzero, the regional piece of the wider EncroChat crackdown, had moved from observation to impact. In one wave, key names were taken off the board. Vincent Coggins was dragged from the shadows he thought Encro had given him. Alongside him, trusted associates like Robert Jarvis, Paul Woodford, and Michael Earl were arrested in coordinated raids. Days later, the net tightened further. Police picked up more of the infrastructure men, Paul Fitzsimmons, Kevin Rimmer, Dean Burrows and Darren Tierney, each one a gear in the machine that kept drugs and violence moving. The reach of the investigation did not stop at the UK border. In Amsterdam, after 2 years on the run, stash house manager Paul Glenn was finally arrested and extradited. Brian Maxwell Sr. and his son, who had spent months entangled in the fallout of a robbery they had not committed, were also taken into custody. The man who had once quietly managed dozens of grow houses and the son whose life he would try to buy back for £1.3 million were now facing their own reckoning. For the public, there was no dramatic live broadcast. no news helicopter circling overhead. The takedown was silent and precise. But in the months and years that followed, the true scale of what had been uncovered became impossible to ignore. Investigators pored over more than 72,000 EncroChat messages linked to the Heighton Firm. Every line of text, every coded reference to pineapples and bits, every casual threat, and every smug joke about cash counted out on a table was matched to real-world events, property transfers, weapons purchases, bulk drug shipments, and plans to execute rivals and scapegoats. In court, defense teams tried to break the backbone of the case by challenging the Encro evidence. They argued it was unlawfully obtained, that it should not be allowed, but the judges ruled against them. The messages stood. That decision did not just seal the fate of the Coggins brothers and their network. It set a precedent that would echo through hundreds of other EncroChat prosecutions across the country. When the sentences finally came, they read like the closing chapter of a criminal dynasty. At 58, Vincent Coggins was handed 28 years for directing violence and multi-kilo drug deals from behind what he believed was an untouchable encrypted screen. Robert Jarvis, 59, once seen as just muscle, was exposed as central to operations and received 25 years after a full trial. Paul Woodford, 58, who had been ready to source firearms and arrange attacks while overseeing cocaine shipments, was given 24 years and 6 months. Michael Earl, 48, received 11 years. Around them, the rest of the network fell into place. Fitzsimmons with 12 years 6 months. Tierney with 12 years 9 months. Rimmer with 16 years. Burrows with 14 years 3 months. Even Glenn, the stash house manager who'd been cut down in his own hallway, was jailed for 11 years, 2 months, for conspiracy to supply cocaine. The men who actually robbed the Heighton Firm were dealt with under a separate investigation, Operation Jail, led by Greater Manchester Police. Jason Cox was sentenced to 14 years and 8 months. His brother Craig saw his original 13 years 6 months reduced to 11 years on appeal. Their inside man, Richard Caswell, received 7 years. The fake courier, Ben Monks Gorton, was jailed for just under 7 years. Then there were the Maxwells. The father who paid, the son who hid. Brian Maxwell Sr. was jailed for 13 years for conspiracy to supply cannabis. His carefully built property empire exposed. His son, Brian Maxwell Jr., received 18 years and 2 months, largely for firearms offenses. The court heard how, while in hiding and terrified the hit was still coming, he had sourced weapons including an AR-15 and an AK-47. Ali Dan's survival, for him, had turned into its own crime. As for the £1.36 million that Maxwell Sr. handed over in a desperate attempt to save his son from a murder order he never gave, it never went back to him. The money, like the land and the house tied up in the deal, was seized under the Proceeds of Crime Act. On paper, it belongs to the state now. In reality, it sits as a permanent reminder of a transaction that brought nothing. No peace, no safety, no forgiveness. So after all the raids, the trials, and the decades of sentences, the question still hangs there. Did justice fit the crime? Did the Cox brothers, the Coggins crew, the insiders and the outsiders get what they deserved? Or did some walk away lighter than they should have, while others paid far more than their share? Let us know what you think in the comments. Were the sentences enough? Was this justice? Or just the best the system could manage against men who thought encrypted screens made them gods? If you want more real UK crime stories like this, cases of empires built on paranoia, loyalty and fear, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a like. Because for every gang taken down, there is always another name, another network, another story waiting in the shadows.